So good evening. Well, evening for me, not for most of you. Um, as most of you know, I talk about happiness in daily living, and that happiness is really peace of mind in daily living. That's where happiness for the human being is able to be found in such a way that is continuous and unbroken. At some point, it can be a continuous, unbroken happiness. And that's a most peculiar place compared to a most peculiar place where happiness is to be found, or peculiar form in which happiness is to be found, compared to where we start off assuming or thinking, believing where happiness is to be found. So we start off thinking, believing, even before spiritual seeking starts, and often that carries on through the spiritual seeking process. We believe that happiness is to be found in outcomes. And outcomes really means pleasure or pain, circumstance, how the worldly set of events unfold, both your material possessions and other outcomes such as success, fame, people liking you or not liking you, that sort of thing. So because we believe that's where happiness is to be found, our efforts, our motivation is in trying to achieve outcomes, trying to change our life circumstance so that it becomes more and more better and better. And in fact, when happiness does start to present itself, does start to show itself, if we're lucky, we'll start to see that it's to be found when that sort of movement, that sort of involvement, that really is an involvement of the thinking mind, slows down. And as it slows down, an appreciation of aspects of ourself that had been covered up starts to happen. And in that appreciation of aspects of ourselves, we see that what has always been really important has always been here, and it's just been missed. It's been overlooked. Sort of a bit like, we could say, the jewel in the crown has been overlooked, and once it starts to become clear what it is, then we see it as the jewel in the crown, and we realize, I've been looking for the jewel in the crown in all the wrong places. So the talks essentially are always about peace of mind, and it happens to be that this peace of mind in the end has to be peace of mind in daily living. We try to transcend daily living for a large part of our seeking process, because we think that finding the absolute is beyond the realm of daily living. And in fact, in practice, even after very deep realizations happen, and even maybe what we can relate to as liberation, we still here. And so if what we end up with is not actually something that adds value in our daily living, then what's the point? And we have to be careful what we mean by adds value in daily living, because that can seem like we're talking about an outcome that is going to give me something more, something that feels better in terms of pleasure or pain than we had before. And the value that it adds is a value of removing, not a value of adding in anything. So peace of mind is the removal, or it is what's there when suffering is absent, when suffering falls away. One of the concepts in the framework that I put forward is the concept that says, what we're really looking for, even though for a large part of our seeking, we don't realize this, is peace of mind in daily living. What it means is it's really only peace of mind that will ever satisfy in the way that feels like the satisfaction that we're really looking for. There's plenty of other satisfactions that we might get, and they tend to be satisfactions in regard to outcomes that are temporary. So we might, I don't know, paint a painting and look at it and it's a great result. We really like it. We're impressed with, let's say, the detail, and there can be a sense of satisfaction. That's a satisfaction of adding in. It's a satisfaction of pleasure. And that doesn't end up satisfying us for an indefinite, ongoing period of time. You can't have that sort of success or that sort of outcome with a painting and then find that it's good enough for the rest of your life, where, if someone were to speak badly to you or hurt you, not consider your feelings, if things go wrong, you're not going to always be able to go back to that painting and say, oh, but that painting, and find that is going to dissolve your ongoing suffering that might arise. So those sort of satisfactions are temporary, and they're more what I would describe as pleasure. So the contentment that truly satisfies, the contentment that when it's there allows us to say, this is what I was always looking for. I didn't realize it, but now that it's here, I realize that this is actually the only thing that really could satisfy. So this is what I was really looking for, even when I didn't know it. So in other words, it's what hopefully we come to realize that is what I'm looking for, and it is peace of mind in daily living. And specifically, peace of mind is the absence of suffering. So if peace of mind is the absence of suffering, it makes sense that we should ask ourselves, what is human suffering? Because once we have a clear set of pointers, a clear set of descriptions, then that enables the process to unfold in a way where the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, because we will start to be able to see all of the components for what they are, and especially what they are in relation to this particular topic of human happiness. So suffering is always about the narrative or the attitude, the relationship that we have with the outcomes that happen throughout the course of the day. The outcomes that happen on a circumstantial level are either pleasurable or painful. So if you make an investment and the investment doubles in value, and you sell the investment and you've ended up with twice as much money as you had a month ago, you could say that's financial pleasure. And similarly, if the investment halved in value and you end up selling it and you end up with half as much money, you can say that's financial pain. That's an outcome in relation to the circumstance as it has unfolded over a period of time. Now, that outcome isn't suffering. That outcome is pleasure or pain. If you break your leg, that is physical pain. And if you find yourself, for example, recovering from an injury and being able to do certain activities that previously were very painful, you could say that is physical pleasure. Or if someone is giving you a massage and it feels good, you can say that's physical pleasure. So once again, there's an example of financial pleasure and pain in relation to the investment. There is physical pleasure or pain, and there's also emotional pleasure and pain. Emotional pleasure or pain is something, for example, in circumstance, like a friend that you haven't seen for a long time surprises you. And you can feel pleasure in the fact that your friend is there and you haven't seen them in a long time. Or let's say you're separated from your parents because of the current situation that's going on. And then after 2 years, you get to see them again. And there is a feeling of love or joy, relief. So that you can say is emotional pleasure. And similarly, if someone that you care about passes away, or someone that you care about shouts at you because you've done something that hurts them, or they just shout at you because they're in a grumpy mood or whatever, that is emotional pain. So the first layer of life, you can say, is the circumstantial layer of life. And it's very important for us to understand that there is always going to be circumstantial outcome. You might just be sitting at a bus stop, looking at the cars go past, and it might be pleasure. You might be enjoying the sun on your face and watching all of the cars go past. You might be enjoying maybe a couple of cars to your liking, classic cars maybe, or whatever. And so you could say that's pleasure. Or you could be sitting there and it could be noisy and very smoggy and not very pleasant. And so you can say that's pain. So there is always, at any point in time, even if it's sort of almost neutral, like it doesn't really register, on the flow of life level, meaning flow of life is outcomes, circumstance. Life is going to be either pleasure or pain. Nothing other than that. And we've seen, and I think it's important for us to register, that the potential of life can be extreme pleasure or extreme pain. We might not experience in our life extreme pleasure or extreme pain to the extent that is capable of being delivered to people in life. But we know that there are people in various situations that are treated extremely badly, cruelly, and extremely kindly. So there is this range of extreme pleasure, extreme pain, and a great variety of extreme pleasure and extreme pain. So if we can get our head around the fact that life is always going to be a form of pleasure or pain, and that is the nature of life. And it's worth noting that because we believe our happiness is to be found in outcomes, really what we have is this hope, this expectation, this intention to be able to control life so that life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And we think that that is manageable, that we might be able to make life such that, for me, one day I will be able to control life so that it is always pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And sin is delusion, because the real nature of the flow of life is out of our control, and sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So that I would say is one of the most important realizations for us to have when we're being objective about life. We say, let me just put aside any wishes or preferences or strong desires or hopes or irrationals that I might have. Let me just put it aside and let me look at this statement that's being made by Roger here, that says the nature of the flow of life is always going to be either pleasure or pain, and largely out of our control, even the times when it seems like it's in our control because we are able to, I don't know, move things about such that the outcome that we would like happens. And then we think, oh yeah, you see, I made it happen just like I want. And so we say, oh, I was in control. But you know that at any point in time, well, sometimes it turns out like you would like. But at any point in time, an aeroplane could fall through the ceiling and get in the way. Now, that's not going to happen every time, so it might not appear like we're not in control. But ultimately, we can trip over and break a leg. We can get into the car and realize that the engine isn't working. And these things show us, oh, we're not in control. So this realization that life is on the flow of life level, either pleasure or pain, we understand that for ourselves because we think about it. It's not a complex concept, and it's a description about something that you've been experiencing day in, day out, year after year and year after year. And hopefully we can see that we might have a strong attachment, a strong investment in life, one day being pleasure, 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 pleasure. And we might see that that strong attachment gets in the way of us acknowledging the actual nature of life. And so when we put our wishful thinking aside, we go, who am I kidding? At any point in time, I can get sick. It's not what I want, but it can happen. And that, if it's painful, if it's inconvenient, we can say is pain in the moment. And at any time, someone can surprise us with a gift or with, an offer to help. And that's pleasure in the moment. So on that layer, that's not where our peace of mind or our suffering exists. Human suffering is always on the layer of our attitude to the pleasure or pain of the flow of life. So I'll say that again. The suffering, the human suffering, and for that matter, the peace of mind, which is the absence of suffering, is on a different layer to the pleasure or pain of the flow of life. The suffering and the peace of mind is always attitudinal to the flow of life. And the attitude that we tend to have that creates suffering is the attitude that we can call the attitude of personal doership, or the attitude of attachment. So it is that deeply ingrained attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcome that essentially forces the layer of suffering that adds a heavier load on top of the inevitable pains from time to time in the flow of life. And it doesn't add suffering on top of only the painful outcomes. It also adds suffering onto the pleasurable outcomes. Less so often, but essentially why that's the case is because if it didn't add suffering, if suffering didn't arise when there's pleasure in the flow of life, then we would find that whenever there is pleasure, we never suffer. And I think many people would attest to the fact that this uncomfortableness with oneself, which really is the nature of suffering, uncomfortableness with oneself, often arises regardless of the circumstance that is sometimes quite favorable. And yet we might say, look, there's friends around me. It's a beautiful day. I've got relatively good circumstances, in the sense that, you say, I've got a roof over my head and I've got food, friends here, everyone's having fun, and yet I don't feel that I am happy. I don't feel comfortable with myself. And so that shows that suffering can arise even when circumstance is pleasurable. And often that suffering is there because we're afraid of what's going to happen when this pleasure ends, or we're looking in the future, worrying about what might happen in the future. We're looking at the past and regretting that I haven't achieved as much as my friends have achieved, and that I don't have a sense of direction. And all of that is an attitude that creates an uncomfortableness with oneself. And the different forms of uncomfortableness can be very unconscious, and can be there because of years of conditioning that has said you're not good enough, you're not heading in the right direction. And so it can create a sense of shame, a sense of inadequacy that tends to just arise and be your standard sense of self. So it's very important for us to get given the description that says your uncomfortableness is essentially an attitude that is based on the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcome. Now, what does these two attitudes that I've suggested, when they are in place, lead to the regular arising of this suffering, this uncomfortableness with oneself, that is never circumstantial, but always our attitude to the circumstance? So it's an extra layer of essentially psychological thinking on top of the biological pleasure or pain. What does it mean? The attitude of personal doership is the deeply ingrained assumption, deeply ingrained belief that what I am as a human being is a separate, independent entity, disconnected, not influenced by anything, so autonomous, with absolute volition and control, and that I am the one that makes my life turn out a certain way. I am the one that controls my thoughts and my feelings and my emotions and my actions and the outcomes. Now, that deeply ingrained belief of personal doership hasn't sort of set itself in place accidentally or without explanation. It sets itself in place by default. It's sort of part of the inevitable evolution of the human being from an embryo through to a newborn, through to a young child, and then adolescent, and so on. It's the default assumption, and it becomes part of what we can know as our idea, our belief of who we are. And so it doesn't get set in place accidentally. It gets set in place because the experience of life on the surface feels like I am a separate, independent entity in control of everything I think, I say, I feel, and I do. So our experience gives us feedback that you are an autonomous entity. And so the intellect, given that experience is there moment after moment after moment, day after day after day, in a very consistent way, there's no reason for any other ingrained belief to set in place. So that's what I mean by saying this belief in personal doership doesn't get set in place for no explainable reason. I'd suggest that the very fact that our experience feels like I am the doer is what sets that belief in place. And with some investigation, following some hints and some prompts and some rationales, we are able to start questioning that belief. Say, is it true? Not just believe the opposite and say, oh, well, I'm not the doer because, I was told that I'm the doer. Told even by the Buddha, for example, let alone, some guy on YouTube, but the Buddha himself, one of the teachings is events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. So events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen. That's a description of the unfolding of life. But there is no individual doer of the circumstances, the deeds, and the consequences. It's essentially saying life is a happening. Life is unfolding. Now, our attitude to life is not that it is a happening, but that it is my doing and your doing. And you shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. I'm not doing life well enough. You guys are definitely not doing life well enough. You better change so that you do life better, so that it delivers pleasure, pleasure, pleasure to me. Because we have the other attitude, which is the attitude of attachment to outcome, which is the attitude that is being unquestioned also, that assumes not only am I the doer, but that my happiness, my contentment, which we know intuitively or experientially, we know that we don't have it. It's sort of part of the human condition that as these attitudes of doership and attachment set in, which is essentially a belief of who we are, and it can be described as a inaccurate belief of who we are, has to lead to a sense of uncomfortableness. It's a bit like trying to put, a 6-fingered glove on, or a 4-fingered glove on, or a glove that's too small or too big. It's not going to fit right. Now, if we have this idea of ourself that is inaccurate, it's not going to fit right. Ultimately, the idea of ourself needs to dissolve, and it's not about replacing it with a more accurate idea of ourself, but rather, if the idea of who we are, the psychological movement that tends to be what reacts and responds and feels life, it's the attitude that interprets the circumstance. When that falls away, we might find ourselves able to just be something more fundamental, to be connected to a part of ourselves that we weren't connected to before. Primarily because we are not so convinced anymore that happiness is out there, that happiness is in getting more and getting the promotion and finding the partner that we don't have, in having financial success, or in traveling around the world. And those can be nice things, and they can make life easier. They can make life more pleasurable if they are part of your flow of life. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with pleasure. But what's very important is for us to realize how we are convinced when we feel unhappy, and someone said, why are you feeling unhappy? And you go, I don't get to travel as much. I don't, and we have an idea of all the things that we need to have. I don't have a purpose in life. If I had a purpose in life, then I'd be happy, because then I'd be able to know in which direction to head in order to find my happiness. So we need to realize, because these are pointers, that's all, and put ticks next to the pointers. Say, yes, there it is. I'm catching myself convinced in this moment that when I get something, X, Y, and Z, just X or just Y, I will be happy. That is the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So someone asked a question just before satsang on email or through a comment. He said, how come peace of mind isn't considered an outcome? Because peace of mind has to do with your attitude, which is a result of the thinking and part of the brain. And so you could say that peace of mind is really an outcome. And the reason that it's not described as an outcome is because the word outcome is being reserved for the circumstantial pleasure or pain of life, and the psychological movement of the brain, the psychological movement of thoughts, is being referred to as suffering, as opposed to outcomes which are pleasure or pain. So if we were talking about some other subject and we haven't separated out these two layers, then yes, of course, the psychological thinking is an outcome of the brain, let's say, or whatever creates thought. But once we have separated out and created this distinction between the flow of life, the circumstantial flow of life, and our attitude to the flow of life, then we find that the peace of mind is on the level of the attitude, and so it's not considered an outcome. And furthermore, because peace of mind is not an active thought of the brain, suffering is an active thought, but peace of mind is the absence of the uncomfortable thought. It's the absence of the suffering. It isn't the presence of attitudinal thought. It's actually just the absence of the attitude of doership, the absence of the attitude of attachment to outcome. So peace of mind being the absence, in a way, makes it less able to be called an outcome. But still, if we were to step right out and look at life in a different context, we could say that peace of mind is a sort of outcome. But fortunately, we've created the distinction that outcomes are on the level of the unfolding of the flow of life. So what I'm laying out in terms of descriptions of life as it pertains primarily to this topic of peace of mind in daily living, there are a whole lot of concepts, a whole lot of descriptions, but they're pretty straightforward descriptions that are talking about everyone's life experience. And if you find that a contemplation and investigation along these lines happens where you put ticks next to the concepts, yes, the flow of life is always pleasure or pain. You come back and you find that your car has been bumped into, pain in the moment. You come back and you find that someone's put a free voucher to a restaurant that you parked in front of, and it says pop in for a free lunch, pleasure in the moment. And the examples are innumerable. Have a nice hot shower in the morning, pleasure in the moment. If hot water system isn't working, you could say it's pain in the moment. So you put a tick next to it. I mean, that's if I was going to suggest, if someone said, "Oh, I'd like a practice to do," I'd say, "Well, for the next week, just continually notice all of the different pleasure and pains." And the categories that we use in this framework is financial pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain, physical pleasure or pain. And see if you can put the categories, put the various outcomes. You know, your bus comes late, or you get to the bus stop late and go, pain in the moment, pleasure in the moment. And if you spend your day or parts of your day investigating this, you'll become pretty familiar with the fact that each day is different, but in principle, there's always a whole lot of pleasure and a whole lot of pain. Doesn't have to be a whole lot of pain or a whole lot of pleasure. It's whatever it is, but it is a combination of only pleasure or pain. And then you might move on and say, let me see my suffering. And the terminology that is being used to describe suffering, I've spoken about what the underlying attitude is that allows the suffering to arise. That's the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And the different forms of suffering that come out of that attitude are guilt, blame, pride. Those first three are really primarily to do with the belief in personal doership. So we feel guilt. Oh, I'm not good enough. I didn't do that right. Guilt and shame. Then we have blame and hatred towards the other. You didn't do that good enough. You hurt me because you didn't do something. And so I hate you. And then pride is, oh, look what I achieved. Look what I did. Look how good I am because an outcome that happened through us was successful. So guilt for those outcomes that are not positive or pleasurable that happen through us. And so we have an attitude of guilt and shame. Blame towards outcomes that happen through the other that are not pleasurable, positive, ideal, what we would like. And so there is blame and hatred, and pride for those outcomes that happen through us that deliver a good outcome. Look what I have achieved. I as the doer, I as the one in control and in charge. So upon the basis of personal doership come these different forms of suffering: guilt, blame, and pride. And then the other wing or the other prong of suffering is worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So those forms of suffering are based on what I need in life is outcomes. And so then we worry about the fact that the outcome that might happen is going to deliver pain to us. And we're so convinced that outcomes are what will determine our happiness. So there's an involvement, there isn't a sense that happiness is independent of outcomes, but rather there's an involvement with outcomes. And so we worry about a whole range of outcomes that might happen. And expectation is the thinking that happens when we assume happiness will be found in a certain outcome, and we say, okay, my happiness will be found when I have business success, for example. And so we're always thinking and trying to control business success. And then inevitably, let's say a client leaves us, sends us an email saying, I'm not happy with the service and I'm moving on, and it's a big client and it's a big dent in your business. And so that's an outcome that gets in the way of where you think your happiness, or sort of puts it hinders, it's not contributing to where you think your happiness is going to be found. And so there's this strong resistance, which is the attachment to outcome. So we have an expectation, I need my business to improve, and then things happen that get in the way of improving business, and we feel resistant to it. No, this can't have happened because my happiness is to be found in success, and this is the opposite of success. And so there's, for a period of time, there's a strong resistance, and that resistance probably includes blame to the client, or which employee can I blame for not putting the right amount of service in, or we might say, oh, it's my fault. And we feel guilt and shame. So it can be a whole bundle of suffering linked in there. But when we look at it, it's guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation / attachment to outcomes. And all of that suffering, in whichever form it arises ultimately as an uncomfortableness, felt as an uncomfortableness with who we are, or an uncomfortableness on the level of self, we could say. Self with a small s, because we will introduce the notion of self with a capital S, like your true self, which is the true self that exists beyond the idea of who I am, the idea of what I need, and the idea of myself as the doer and the other as the doer. So if that's the attitude that leads to suffering, and suffering is what gets in the way of our peace of mind, and ultimately the suggestion is peace of mind, unbroken peace of mind, which means when this attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes stop arising, if that's what we're really looking for, if that's the form in which human happiness is available, then what is the attitude that leads to that, given we've investigated the attitude that leads to the suffering? I call it an attitude, which we could say an attitude of non-doership or an attitude of non-attachment. That description of the attitude of non-doership and the attitude of non-attachment really is referring to when the attitude of doership and the attitude of attachment dissolve. And that the dissolving of that attitude leads to the capacity to just be, to be present with what is, understanding that, yes, life is going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, and yet remaining connected rather than feeling attitudinally involved with the outcome, feeling attacked by the outcome, feeling like one's sense of self is diminished because of an outcome. So really, it means that we start to find a place that we can remain grounded in, even when outcomes are not as we would like, and know I am, like right now, I am fully, I am complete. I am not missing something that I have to find in the future. And that's not something that we have to pretend or say to ourselves. It's not an intellectual knowing where we have to convince ourselves. It's actually about dropping out of the very active thinking and finding this quietness, this dimension of being. And that's the true self that exists outside of the intellect. It is an essence. It is its very nature is to be, exist, and it's the essence of the self with a capital S, the true self. We can say it's referred to as the absolute or God sometimes, primarily because when we know ourself as the small self, which feels so contracted and uncomfortable and disconnected because we feel like we're an autonomous entity. Any glimpses of the true self feel like they must be something else. They can't, that's not who I am, because we've had a whole lifetime of knowing ourselves as, knowing ourselves through this image, this set of beliefs that frankly we didn't put in place, but they get put in place by the natural evolution that happens. And so then if some glimpses start coming in, we assume this is bigger than me. This is outside of me, because it's not what we're used to. And so before those glimpses or those connections happen, we get given teachings that help point us in the right direction, help as best as they can to describe the undescribable, so that if the thinking is heading in the wrong direction, if it is perpetuating a movement in a direction that is away from connection, for example, there's a hope, a possibility that the pointers will allow a connection to happen. And so those pointers often refer to this aspect of self as God or the absolute, and that the mission is to connect to the absolute, to connect to God, and that we will know God not intellectually, but by being that aspect of God. And that aspect of God or source is referred to as awareness and beingness, I amness, isness. And all these words, I amness, isness, what is, trying to point us out of the narrative of what should be and what isn't, and what was but isn't now, and what I didn't do and what I did do, what I might not do, what might happen. It's trying to point us out of that and just saying, just be with what is. And that being with what is isn't another series of thoughts that is, oh, I'm now being, I'm not thinking about the past. I don't want to think about it. I just want to be with what is. It's even the absence of that. And because our thinking and the human movement is so ingrained in a particular direction that it's useful for that to be referred to as God or source or the absolute, because then we have a reason to stop, in a way, to interfere with how we know ourselves and seek something bigger than us, outside of thought. So this sort of reminds me of a very beautiful Rumi poem that tries to point to this, out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing. So that's the suggestion, that it's outside of our thinking. So the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, which is how I should act, how you should act, how life should turn out. So it's another way of pointing to just being with what is, the absence of our thinking mind. So out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So really it's saying the true self, my true self, is that field, and your true self is that field. And that's the only place that we can really meet. We can know each other by knowing ourselves outside of the ideas of right doing and wrong doing. So beyond implies transcending or prior to. So on a different dimension, beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And when the soul lies down in the ground, which it implies a lying down as a rolling back into. So it's implying a being, sort of a resting, a merging with the field. So when you get to be the field, life is too full to talk about. And that too full means there is no need for more. We don't feel like there is something lacking, that I need to get this and that, and that's when I'll be happy. Soul merges and becomes that field of beingness. That's where we get the direct feedback that says, I am complete. There isn't any sense that something is missing. And that's when we realize that any sense of something missing is when we are disconnected from that. And when we're disconnected from that, the self isn't potently vibrating in us. And so what we're left with is the uncomfortableness of this small psychological self that feels like it is a independent, disconnected entity that's struggling in life to get somewhere, and life is always getting in the way of where it's trying to go. And so it feels frustrated and uncomfortable. Not an uncomfortableness of the circumstance. There might be that would be pain, but it feels uncomfortable with itself. It just doesn't feel connected, complete, worthy. And the dropping into being is really a dissolving of the thinking mind. So we really never are incomplete. There's just a very convincing set of thoughts that are so deeply ingrained and unconscious that they don't even look like thoughts. They just appear as a feeling of dissatisfaction. And it's that dissatisfaction that we can't really put our finger on. You know, it's the sort of thing that will pop up maybe very regularly for some people, or for other people, they just sort of look back and they go, I work hard, I'm always rushing around, and what's the point? Why am I here? I'm getting older, and I see that most of my life is has gone, and the runway sort of gets obvious that there's not an infinite runway. And so that's when we really start wondering what's the point, and maybe even feeling like I've missed the point, and I haven't succeeded in life because either we think I feel unhappy because I haven't done as well as other family members or friends or people we went to school with, or a lot of success has been achieved and yet there's a sense of emptiness. And so it becomes obvious, it doesn't seem like it's about outcomes, because let's say someone has achieved a lot of outcomes and yet they still feel this uncomfortableness. And so they say, I've missed the point in life because I don't feel content. And it seems like it's something fundamentally wrong that is real. It really feels like something is missing. And yet, if a stopping happens, a stopping and being happens, in an instant, the uncomfortableness dissolves. And there is an instant sense, there never was anything missing. There was a disconnection from the beingness and the presence of a thinking that wasn't seen as thinking. And because the thinking is attitudinal to circumstance, which means it is an uncomfortableness that arises because of a thought about the past, a thought about the future, a thought about what has or hasn't happened. Because it's an attitude about circumstance, it feels like it is about circumstance. And so it's very important for us to realize, to see that there is this, this layer of thinking that is attitudinal to circumstance. And it can be very subtle and it can be easily missed because it is a thinking about circumstance. So if someone is feeling uncomfortable because they're blaming someone, for example, and I say, why are you feeling unhappy? And they'll say, because of what they did. And they're not. They're feeling unhappy because of their attitude towards what the person did. Right? But their attitude is, he hurt me, I hate you. He hurt me, I hate him. And that's what's making them feel uncomfortable. And yet you say, why are you unhappy? And they don't say, oh, because of my attitude to what he did, but because of what he did. And the truth is, if the person did that, whatever they did, and the thinking wasn't there, then what they did is still what they did. So the pain, let's say they stole something from you, or they spoke about you behind your back, or gave the job to someone else when they promised it to you. All sorts of things that people can do that hurt, deliver pain, and then we might blame them and feel uncomfortable about the fact that we didn't get the job when we were promised it, that a friend let us down, whatever. And remember, if we're blaming, then there's the pain of the circumstance and the added and much heavier load of the friend. And yet, why are you unhappy? And it's because I didn't get the job. Now, imagine the person who gets the job. It's painful, and yet they don't have the same attitude towards it. They have the attitude, no, right? It was there for me to do the job. That's how life rolls. Sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And I'm getting better more. And I don't know, it just doesn't seem worth it. In the circumstance is the same, and yet no unhappiness. Because the unhappiness is always on the level of the attitude, not on the level of the circumstance. This makes the down of a topic, so we can some question and answers. At this point, it's worth noting that we have biological reactions and psychological. Biological reactions are part of the life, the pleasure and pain. The working mind, when biological reactions are thought to biological, then part of the working mind. When it is psychological reaction built in worry, expectation, we call the word is functional thinking that might put forward an argument to someone or a proposition, might work out how much money you need to take on holiday, what time you need to call the cab to take you to the airport, planning your week, doing your grocery list. All of that is functional thinking. It's not an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other. And so that is thinking that fits into the biological reaction theory. An outcome of the brain, but in relation to circumstance. And then we have the thinking, which is attitudinal to circumstance and is the suffering part of the thinking mind. So thinking that is not functional thinking, not part of the working mind. And that we call the psychological reactions. Now, the biological reactions, which could, let's say, include excitement, could be tiredness, could be anger. Now, someone would say, oh, anger, that must be on the psychological level, that's suffering. It's not necessarily, because if someone is, breaking your windows, it doesn't make sense to be laughing, does it? Circumstantially, look, he's breaking my windows, how funny. Or even this idea we have that, we need to accept everything, so we need to be Zen-like. It's like, someone's breaking my windows. That's, in a way, an idea what is going to happen is you see someone about to break your car window, and it's like, hey, what are you doing? Anger arises. It's appropriate in the circumstance, and it's part of the biological reaction based on the circumstance. And then once the circumstance is finished, let's say he breaks the window and runs off, it's understood. So you might be angry in the moment, and then the anger, which is a sort of a vertical anger in time, doesn't get extended horizontally. So you're not thinking about it and blaming the person for breaking your window for weeks and weeks and weeks. It's like, oh yeah, that happened, and that's part of how life unfolds. It was financial pain, inconvenience, pain. And yet then the attitude is, all of that was happening according to God's will. It's life unfolding. That is there is no individual doer thereof. That doesn't mean that what we're saying is Joe Bloggs didn't break the window. We're saying, yes, Joe Bloggs was the instrument through which the window got broken. But I understand that instrument was essentially part of the unfolding of life, what we could say destiny, the predetermined story of life, or God's will. And seeing that we're not the doer, and the basis on which we're not the doer is understanding that each of us is essentially a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the genes, we can simplistically look at it as the sperm and the egg come together, and it creates a blueprint, a magical blueprint that continues to grow. And that's when the baby is born, and then the baby continues to grow, and all of that growing just following sort of a pretty mystical blueprint that creates the hardware, you could say. That hardware is conditioned by the environment in which it grows up. Primarily, the conditioning is the family you're born into, the school you go to, the religious tendencies of the grow up in, or the family, the church you go to, the politics, the culture, the friends that you make. All of that influences the instrument that we are, and the combination of the genes and up-to-date conditioning force us to act in a particular way in each moment. Very much like, you can look at the example of two chemicals. They come together and they don't choose. They don't sit down and have a conference. They don't decide how to act. They just react, either in an inert way or in a violent, explosive way, depending on the characteristics of the two chemicals, how they actually, each chemical is, and how they fit together. So the reaction is impersonal. It just happens. And we are essentially very complex chemicals, to go back to the analogy. And we're always reacting to the circumstance, either inert reactions or explosive reactions. Those reactions are not my doing. They're a happening based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Our attitude about ourselves is, oh, that's my thought that I control. And therefore, if I have a thought that is not ideal, or an action that's not ideal, I say, oh, I shouldn't have acted that way. And not only I shouldn't have acted because it delivered an outcome that isn't great, because we can look at an outcome once it's happened and say, oh, that outcome happened because of, let's say, a step before that, because I shouted or I lost my temper. And so either I lost my temper, I lost my job. Okay, so we can say that if I hadn't have shouted, I might not have lost my job. But to think that, oh, I could have acted differently is a step further than just making the thing that says, if I hadn't have shouted, I may not have lost my job. That's a true statement. But to think I shouldn't have shouted, I should have done it differently, is to not appreciate that we are these complex chemicals that will react one way or the other. We're either going to be able to remain calm in the circumstance, someone challenges us and we just remain calm, or someone challenges and we explode. And whether, often our attachment to right doing and wrong doing says, oh, I want to be the one that remains calm. And hopefully we drop that, because that's an expectation. That's part of what gets us to resist life. So it will get us to resist the fact we didn't remain calm. And if this notion I'm putting forward sits in, then we realize that not remaining calm we shouldn't set the objective up of calm or not getting angry. Just whatever happens was a happening and not my doing. It was a reaction. It was an arising according to life's will, according to God's will. Because life, God, put in place the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and God or life created the particular circumstance as it is. I didn't create the circumstance. There's birds flying in and out of the trees and leaves falling off the trees and airplanes flying past. I'm not in control of all of those factors. And even the factors like putting table and chairs outside that seem very much like my doing, so I create that part of the circumstance. Really, we see that I was able to put the tables and chairs and in that position because those are where the thought said the tables and chairs should go, and the memory that says that, oh, you have to put the table and chairs out. And then when we look at it, we see that's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's very easy for the memory, that the thought, you have to put the table and chairs out, to not have arisen. And so even those actions that we say are my doing happen that way because of a whole very complex set of movements inside of us. Now, this has to be contemplated. It really needs to be investigated. It's not complex. It doesn't have to be investigated in ways that are really complex. I mean, the concept is very simple. But once again, we have to see it over and over again. It's like, oh, I have mannerisms like my dad. I respond like my dad and whatever. And maybe we go, why is that? Maybe it's because, not because I'm in control, but because part of the blueprint is similar to that of my dad's, or because of the conditioning that happened when I was growing up. And so, he peels an orange a certain way and I peel an orange a certain way. Or he peels an orange a certain way, and so I don't peel it like that because I don't want to peel my oranges like my dad. And so we realize that whatever it is, it's a result of a whole lot of factors that formed us like that. So everyone is always being lived. We're all being lived by life. So what is the human being? The human being is an instrument, a biological instrument, through which the consciousness of Source functions. And the consciousness of Source is experiencing life from the particular perspective of an individual. We could call that personal consciousness, meaning Source or God consciousness is aware of life from the perspective of each instrument through which it inhabits, having a very broad range of experiences. And my experience, your experience, is actually the experience that Source is experiencing. Source isn't experiencing it like from out there via CCTV, but the very consciousness functioning through you that we relate to as my consciousness is the consciousness of Source functioning through a particular body-mind organism, experiencing life. So if we're looking for God, I wonder where I'm going to find God. Where is God? Where is Source? And it's closer than close. And just, I said in closing, this is the last point. It's an interesting point. It helps explain once again why the belief in personal doership is there. It's because the experience feels like I am the doer. And one of the reasons it feels like I'm the doer is because thoughts arise and then actions tend to follow the thoughts. And we can have a thought or a thought process that sort of says, on the weekend, I've been asked to go to this excursion and I can go on this excursion, but it's quite expensive. Or I could do what I normally do, which is quite fun, and it's not going to be as expensive. But that excursion is something I've never done before. I've always wanted to do it. And there's some friends that I haven't seen for a long time. So with weighing it up, and you think, okay, I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to spend the money and I'm going to go on that excursion. So we've all seen those thoughts happening in our life. And it seems like on the surface, what's happened is we've taken those thoughts as the calculation that makes us act or decide something and then act accordingly. And when you look at it more closely, you might realize that thoughts that we're aware of are not at all the calculation. They're a sort of proxy for the calculation. They are something that might be a decoy to create this confusion of personal doership. But for as long as they're there and we have assumed they are the calculation, they are the decision and the decision-making process, then we will see the outcome and say, oh, that is a result of the thought. And because the thought feels like it's my doing, then we say the thought was my doing, and therefore the outcome was my doing. Now, if we see that the thought is a result of the genes and update conditioning, then we might say, oh, the thought that appears or feels like my doing is actually completely influenced, not by an independent me, but by a biological instrument, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So that's one way of seeing that the thought is not my doing. The other way is to realize that the thought is just something that arises. It's a proxy for the calculation. And the real calculation happens in the background and we never experience it. And because we don't experience it, we don't put it into the equation or we don't put it on the table and then form a conclusion, because that's what's happened from a very young age. We see all of the bits of experience and we draw conclusions based on all the things that we can see. And because there's a whole lot of things happening in the background that we can't see and that we've never been told about, we leave out a whole lot of components. And so we draw a conclusion about how things work based on our assessment of the components that do present themselves. And now, if those components were the only components, there's half a chance that we might end up with a good conclusion. But if there's a whole lot of components that actually exist and we've never taken them into consideration, then it makes sense that our conclusion about how things work could be completely and probably are completely off. So I'm suggesting that the thoughts are not the calculation themselves. So what's the calculation? The calculation is something that happens that we don't even realize, don't even have access to, don't see it happening. It's the neural network, it's the synapses firing, it's the electromagnetic pulses, it's the various hormones and chemicals that are mixing around. Billions, literally billions of neurons firing, synapses, networks that have been structured to light up a certain way, given certain stimuli that come in, given the circumstance. And it's a machine that is thousands and thousands and millions, probably times more powerful than the strongest supercomputers that we have. The amount of data that is being crunched by the brain is, in each second, would take supercomputers minutes or hours to calculate, and our brain is calculating it instantaneously. So all of the calculations are happening in the background where our consciousness, our awareness doesn't have access to see that. And yet we can consider that certain parts of science understand the functioning of the brain. And this is not to say that the brain is the absolute or that material explanations are the absolute truth explanation of how it's all happening. But we can't dismiss it as, oh, that's not how it happens. And that would be an error if we're told certain teachings, because teachings are just concepts, they're not the truth. They're a framework that will help the brain as it stands at a particular point in time dissolve the not useful beliefs. So, I can say that there's no harm running with material explanations of how things happen as far as dissolving the belief in personal doership, assuming so it's either you say God's will and it all spontaneously happens and causality has nothing to do with how things happen. That's one way of looking at it. Still, essentially, that is dissolving the belief in personal doership. Thoughts just come out of nowhere, and therefore I'm not the doer of them. They happen, and then the action happens, and it's all spontaneous. It's not causal. It's all an illusion and an appearance, and so there is no doer. The other is the thoughts are a manifestation or a proxy for the real calculations that are bits and bytes. They happen on that level, and then there is a interface that delivers a thought that tells us what has happened, what has been decided. And we think that the thought is the calculation, and that we are the thought and we are the calculator. So something for you to add into your investigation and contemplation. Well, at this stage, there doesn't look like there's any questions or questioners. So